negotiation was already lost before a single word had been spoken. Not because the numbers were wrong, not because the strategy lacked sophistication, not because the market conditions were unfavorable. The negotiation was lost because one man entered the room seeking approval, while another entered the room carrying authority. The distinction was invisible to most observers. The presentations appeared equally polished. The credentials appeared equally impressive. The financial projections appeared equally persuasive. Yet beneath the surface, hidden beneath language, posture, timing, and emotional composure, existed a force that would quietly determine the outcome long before the first contract was reviewed. One man needed the deal. The other man merely evaluated it, and the room felt the difference immediately. Human beings possess an extraordinary sensitivity to status signals. Long before logic begins operating consciously, perception starts evaluating confidence, certainty, emotional stability, and internal self-regard. Entire careers rise or fall on this invisible process. Entire organizations are shaped by it. Entire fortunes are accumulated or lost because one individual unknowingly communicates dependence, while another communicates sovereignty. Most people spend their lives misunderstanding power. They imagine power is granted externally. They believe it emerges from titles, offices, credentials, wealth, endorsements, media attention, or institutional recognition. They spend years chasing symbols while remaining psychologically dependent on the approval those symbols supposedly represent. The elite eventually discover a far more unsettling truth. The environment almost always mirrors the value you silently assign yourself, not the value you claim, not the value you advertise, the value you genuinely believe, and that belief radiates through behavior with astonishing consistency. This is why some leaders command respect before they possess significant resources. This is why some executives struggle to command respect despite possessing extraordinary resources. The difference is rarely found in external assets. It is found in internal positioning. Internal positioning becomes external reality. The world senses it. Markets sense it. Investors sense it. Competitors sense it. Employees sense it. And once this realization is understood deeply, an entirely different model of leadership begins emerging. The leader stops asking how to appear important. The leader begins asking how to become internally immovable. This shift changes everything, because immovability creates gravity. Gravity creates influence. Influence creates leverage, and leverage determines outcomes. There is a reason history remembers certain individuals as unusually commanding, even when they spoke very little. Their authority did not originate from constant persuasion. It originated from certainty. They behaved as though value existed independently of external recognition because they understood something most people never fully grasp. Neediness is expensive. Not financially, psychologically. The moment an individual begins seeking validation from the environment gains influence over that individual. The moment a leader requires approval to maintain confidence becomes negotiable. The moment self-worth becomes dependent on external acceptance, leverage begins disappearing. This is where executive sovereignty begins, not with arrogance, not with entitlement, not with superiority, but with independence. The ability to maintain self-respect regardless of immediate outcomes. The ability to remain composed regardless of temporary rejection. The ability to preserve dignity even when surrounded by uncertainty. Most professionals spend enormous energy trying to convince others of their value. The sovereign leader behaves differently. The sovereign leader focuses on becoming valuable. This sounds subtle. It is not. It is transformative. One approach directs energy outward. The other directs energy inward. One seeks recognition. The other develops substance. One chases validation. The other cultivates capability. Over time, the gap becomes enormous. Because capability compounds, validation does not. There is a fascinating paradox hidden inside elite commercial environments. The individuals who appear least desperate for opportunities often receive the greatest opportunities. The organizations that seem least dependent upon capital often attract the most capital. The leaders who appear least concerned with status often acquire the highest status. Most observers interpret this incorrectly. They assume confidence creates results. The reality is more complex. Confidence changes behavior. Behavior changes perception. Perception changes opportunity. Opportunity changes outcomes. The chain begins internally, long before it becomes visible externally. This is why aristocratic positioning has always fascinated serious students of power. Not because aristocracy itself possesses inherent virtue, but because aristocratic psychology contains a strategic lesson. The true aristocrat does not negotiate self-worth continuously. The true aristocrat begins from an assumption of inherent dignity. That assumption changes posture, changes communication, changes decision-making, changes emotional regulation. Most importantly, it changes standards. The sovereign leader refuses opportunities that violate standards, refuses partnerships that compromise standards, refuses negotiations that diminish standards, not because alternatives are guaranteed, because dignity is non-negotiable. This creates extraordinary leverage. Markets constantly test boundaries. People test boundaries. Institutions test boundaries. Competitors test boundaries. The individual without internal standards eventually bends under pressure. The individual anchored by internal standards becomes predictable in the most valuable way possible. Predictably principled. Predictably disciplined. Predictably composed. Trust begins forming around such individuals because consistency reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty remains one of the most expensive costs in commercial environments. Investors do not merely invest in products, they invest in judgment. Clients do not merely purchase services, they purchase certainty. Markets do not merely reward innovation, they reward confidence in execution. All of these qualities emerge more naturally when self-worth is internally anchored. The average professional enters a room hoping to be accepted. The sovereign professional enters a room evaluating alignment. This single psychological shift alters the entire negotiation dynamic. One party seeks permission. The other party seeks truth. One party hopes to qualify. The other party seeks compatibility. One party fears rejection. The other party understands selection. Selection is powerful because selection implies abundance. Abundance implies confidence. Confidence implies value. The chain operates continuously beneath conscious awareness. This is why elite negotiators often appear remarkably calm under pressure. Their composure is not merely emotional discipline, it is structural. Their identity is not attached to immediate outcomes, therefore pressure loses much of its influence. Pressure only works effectively when it threatens something a person fears losing. The sovereign leader has already detached self-worth from temporary outcomes. This creates unusual freedom. Freedom to walk away. Freedom to remain silent. Freedom to think clearly. Freedom to reject urgency. Freedom to preserve standards. Most people underestimate how much leverage originates from the ability to leave. Not physically, psychologically. The willingness to remain unattached creates extraordinary strategic strength, because attachment creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites manipulation. The modern business world constantly encourages emotional attachment. Attach yourself to growth targets. Attach yourself to recognition. Attach yourself to visibility. Attach yourself to public perception. Attach yourself to market opinion. The sovereign individual resists this pressure, not because outcomes do not matter, because identity matters more. Identity determines behavior. Behavior determines results. Results never permanently determine identity. This inversion separates durable leaders from fragile ones. Fragile leaders become emotionally destabilized by setbacks because setbacks threaten self-worth. Durable leaders absorb setbacks because self-worth remains intact. The distinction appears philosophical until one observes it in practice. Then it becomes obvious. One executive loses a contract and spirals into self-doubt. Another executive loses a contract and calmly evaluates the lesson. One executive receives criticism and becomes defensive. Another executive receives criticism and remains curious. One executive chases approval relentlessly. Another executive preserves standards relentlessly. Over time, the second individual accumulates extraordinary advantages. Not because life becomes easier, because clarity becomes stronger. Clarity is perhaps the most underrated asset in executive life. Most poor decisions originate from distorted self-perception. Fear distorts judgment. Insecurity distorts judgment. Ego distorts judgment. Neediness distorts judgment. The sovereign leader reduces these distortions through internal stability. Internal stability creates strategic patience. Strategic patience creates superior timing. Superior timing creates superior outcomes. And superior outcomes reinforce authority. This process compounds for decades. Eventually, something remarkable occurs. The environment begins responding differently. Competitors sense certainty. Employees sense certainty. Envy stores sense certainty. Clients sense certainty. The leader no longer needs to project authority aggressively because authority has become embedded within behavior itself. This is the phase where true leverage emerges, not performative leverage, not theatrical leverage, real leverage, the kind that influences rooms before conversations begin, the kind that changes negotiation dynamics before proposals are exchanged, the kind that quietly shifts power structures without visible confrontation. Most people never reach this level because they remain trapped inside a cycle of external validation. They continue measuring themselves through opinions, titles, rankings, attention, and temporary outcomes. Their confidence fluctuates with circumstances. Their self-perception fluctuates with feedback. And fluctuating self-perception creates fluctuating behavior. Fluctuating behavior creates inconsistent results. The sovereign leader escapes this cycle completely. The source of confidence moves inward. The source of dignity moves inward. The source of authority moves inward. Once this occurs, the environment loses much of its ability to dictate emotional states, and emotional independence becomes strategic independence. This is the hidden secret beneath elite positioning. Not image, not branding, not performance. Identity. The identity of a person who has decided that dignity exists prior to recognition, that value exists prior to validation, that authority exists prior to permission. This identity changes every interaction, every negotiation, every decision, every opportunity, every refusal, until eventually the final revelation becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest source of leverage in commercial life is not money, not connections, not reputation, not even expertise. The greatest source of leverage is an unshakable internal conviction that your value does not depend upon the approval of the environment. Because the moment a leader reaches that state, hierarchy begins reorganizing itself around them. Competitors become reactive. Negotiations become asymmetrical. capital becomes attracted rather than pursued.